First, I just wanted to make a comment about the first reading. Is not sure exactly why Moses ground the calf down and scattered it over the waters for the people to drink. But this is my pondering. I could be way off base here. You can find this out on your own if you do the research. But maybe it's because God was showing through Moses, true worship must mean coming in union. The Old Testament understanding of worship, not inside the Israelite, but outside in the pagan understanding, was, I worship, but I have nothing to do with you. I worship because I want something from you. But God is showing, no, true worship means union between God and His people. And so, if you are going to try to have union with this calf, let's show you what it looks like. You have to consume it. A sign of what true worship is, where God gives us His flesh to eat in the Eucharist. A thought. I'm not sure if it's right. But I want to talk more about St. Ignatius today. Today is Feast of St. Ignatius of Loyola. And you may have heard a little bit about his conversion story. He used it as part of his discernment of spirits, where he talked about how he was kind of a wild guy, and he did some really bad things, but he had great verve and vigor, and people followed him. He was very charismatic in that way. People followed him to the point where he was in the army and defending a particular castle, and there was very little chance of them being successful because of the size and the power of the army coming against them. So everyone was ready to give in, but he said no, and they all followed him in defending this place. Well, until his leg got shattered by a cannonball, and so they then all let in, and so he went and was convalescing for a number of months, long time, and the story of them having to re-break his leg and all this stuff in times before modern anesthesia, it's agonizing to listen to. But in that time, he was looking for books to read, and the things he liked to read were the stories of knight errantry, like, the type of stuff that got Don Quixote into so much trouble. And so what happens? They don't have any of those books there. So what do they give him? Books of the lives of the saints and of Christ. And so he reads those and starts imagining him doing the same things as St. Dominic and St. Francis does, but then he sometimes goes into his dreams of being a knight again and all that stuff. And what happened was God then gave him this dryness. While he was imagining both of these things, he had a joy in it. But after he stopped thinking about the worldly things, he had this dryness in his soul. But after he stopped thinking about being more like St. Francis or St. Dominic, doing the saintly things, his soul was continued filled with joy, even as he went off to think about other things. But this happened for a while. He didn't notice anything. But then one day, he says in his autobiography, his eyes were opened a little. And he noticed the difference. He says, this is the difference of the Spirit of God, the good spirit, versus the bad spirit, which leaves us dry and empty. And that was the beginning of his spiritual discernment. He then became a master of spiritual discernment. He gives us 14 rules of discerning between consolation and desolation. And where is God moving? Where is the good spirit moving? Where is the bad spirit moving in our lives? And the desolation, what that is doing. But the very first thing we need to do in our spiritual lives is to notice, to be aware. What is going on in my soul? Too often we're just going on automatic and we're not even paying attention to what's going on inside. And what then happens is when we're in, for instance, a period of spiritual desolation, if we're not paying attention to it, we can just kind of feel poorly in the Spirit and feel distant from God, and we try to find other things to fill that emptiness. But if we become aware, wait, this is what's going on in my heart and my soul, then we can start to say, well, how do I deal with this? So in his 14 rules, the first 2 rules he's talking about which direction our soul is generally going in, towards God or towards the enemy. Second 2 rules he defines what is spiritual consolation, what is spiritual desolation. And then from rules 5 through 14 he gets into these are what you do when you're dealing with primarily spiritual desolation. So rule 5, when you're in spiritual desolation, you got the 5 Ds. Don't do different during desolation. When you're in spiritual desolation, if you have spiritual routines and things, don't then change what you're doing. Oh, this is exhausting, I'm tired, I'm not getting anything out of this, so maybe I'll try doing this novena or doing something else. It's just not working, or I'm going to give up on my prayer time because it's just, don't do different during desolation. Rule 6 is in desolation, so you don't change your spiritual routine, but you change yourself. And so he says, when you're in prayer, when you're in desolation, spiritual desolation, you look more towards praying against that desolation. Saying, okay, Lord, help me to break free from this desolation. To meditate on the truths of faith, how God has been faithful to us before in pulling us out of spiritual desolation. Examination of, when did this begin? How did this begin in my life? Was there a moment? Was there a decision I made? Was there something that happened to me? When did this begin? So that we can then work on bringing healing to that. And then he says, do penances, but little penances. He's not saying, fast for a week. He's saying in these little penances, they can be things like, you feel like you want to end your prayer time with, let's say you have this. You say, every day I pray for an hour. You feel like you need to end after 45 minutes. It's just so dry. He says, instead of ending early, end late. But not like 15 minutes late, but like 2 minutes. Just a little bit extra. Or a little penance, you're feeling kind of empty, and normally what happens, I would go to the fridge at that point. None of you experienced that before. Well, he says, in that you might then say, a little penance might be, I will wait 15 minutes before going to the fridge to try to fill my empty. Little things, just tiny things. So, in desolation, change ourself more. More prayer against desolation, meditation on the truths of faith and how God has been faithful to us, examination of what am I feeling, what's going on in my life, and then the little penances. 7th is, in desolation, consider that I can resist with God's grace. He always gives us the help to be able to do this. That I don't just have to go along with this. I can resist this. The 8th is, in desolation, work patience and think that soon God will console us. God will pull me out of desolation, even sooner than I expect. Because it seems like, this is going to be the way I'm going to be forever. But the Lord is saying, no. It will come to an end. And then use the 6th rule about doing all these, changing ourselves to do it. In the 9th rule, there are 3 causes for desolation, and to consider that. There are 3 causes for desolation. One might be my sin has caused my desolation. Second might be that God is trying me because He wants to test me and to help me to grow. Or the third is just to teach me humility, to give me understanding that everything is of God. A lot of times we think that desolation is all our fault. And sometimes it is. Sometimes it's my sin. But there are 2 other reasons spiritual desolation happens. Not just because I've sinned, but also because sometimes God is trying me and testing me and helping me to grow. And sometimes He's just saying, remember, it's all about me. It's not your work, it's me. The 10th rule is in consolation. So when we're not in spiritual desolation, but when we're in spiritual consolation, think, how am I going to act when I'm in desolation? Make a plan. Prepare ourselves. What are the things I need to set up so that when I start to go into that desolation, I don't have to fall so deeply into it? One of the suggestions was make a practical thing was make a a song list that will lead you out of desolation. So some of the songs that will help you build up. And so I have that on my phone. So when I start to fall, I say, okay, go into the consolation from desolation, and I press the random, and I let God pick those songs for me that'll help to build me up. The 11th, in consolation, humbly think of the times that I'm in desolation. So don't think, well, this is all me, but okay, God is allowing this as gift and grace. But the second part is, when in desolation, think all that we can do with God to resist and take strength from this. So we say, okay, in desolation, God, I'm thinking about consolation. God is going to bring me out of this. And then the 12th through the 14th stations are really kind of like the practical in terms of confront the enemy immediately. Don't let it become from a snowball to an avalanche. Stop it early. Second is, tell someone who knows how to deal with this so that there's no secrets. Because when it comes from the darkness to the light, very often it loses its power. And then the 14th, the last of them, is shore up the defenses. Look and say, what are the areas where I'm weak in my life? Where I usually will fall into desolation. Shore those up, especially the weakest point. Because then the enemy's going to have to find another place to attack us. We turn to the Lord today and we ask, through the intercession of St. Ignatius of Loyola, that he will help us to be aware of what's going on in our souls, so that we can then see, is this consolation, is this desolation, what's going on inside of myself, and then take the proper action to be able to follow where the Lord leads.